On a cold January night in 1961, long before most Americans had any idea how close their country would come to obliteration from within, a massive B-52 Stratofortress bomber sliced through the dark skies of North Carolina, its 8 engines humming with the confident power of a nation at the peak of the Cold War. Carrying within its belly a pair of Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each one more than 250 times stronger than the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima. And while the mission was routine, part of America's airborne alert system known as Operation Chrome Dome, which kept nuclear-armed bombers in constant flight in case the Soviets launched a surprise attack. Nothing about the night itself hinted at the catastrophe quietly taking shape, as the bomber's crew noticed a growing problem deep inside the plane's wing, where a fuel leak had begun spewing thousands of gallons into the freezing air. The leak, initially manageable, quickly spun out of control as pressure built and fuel streamed like liquid fire across the aircraft's structure. And although the crew had trained for nearly every scenario imaginable, including Soviet interceptors, missile launches, and emergency landings, none of them were prepared for what began happening next as the wing structure weakened, the aircraft's electrical systems flickered, and the pilot, Major Walter Tulloch, fought desperately to keep the bomber level. At 9,000 feet, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. The right wing of the B-52 suddenly snapped apart from the fuselage with a sickening metallic scream, sending the aircraft into a violent, uncontrollable spin as alarms blared and red lights flooded the cockpit, forcing Major Tulloch to order his crew to bail out in the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might survive the disintegrating nuclear bomber. One by one, crew members launched themselves into the night sky, parachutes snapping open as the giant aircraft tore itself apart behind them. But the bomber wasn't falling alone. As the B-52 shredded into flaming wreckage over rural farmland, its deadly cargo, the 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, ripped free from their mounting racks and plunged toward the earth below. In the moment they separated from the collapsing aircraft, the bombs transitioned into their drop state, entering the early phases of their arming sequence in the same way they would if they had been intentionally released over a Soviet target. When the first bomb fell, its parachute deployed exactly as designed, slowing its descent as if preparing for a deliberate nuclear strike. With the parachute opening successfully, the bomb automatically triggered 3 of the 4 arming mechanisms needed for detonation, following its programming flawlessly because it had no way of knowing it had been dropped in an accident. Meanwhile, the second bomb plummeted straight into the ground at terminal velocity, slamming into the mud of a North Carolina tobacco field with enough force to bury part of its structure nearly 20 feet underground. And here lies the most chilling truth of the Goldsboro incident. According to declassified documents published decades later, the first bomb came within a single electrical switch, one low-voltage arm, safe switch, of detonating a 4-megaton hydrogen blast powerful enough to vaporize everything within an 8-mile radius and kill tens of thousands across North Carolina, with fallout drifting up the East Coast toward Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and New York. As the bombs fell, farmers in the area heard what sounded like thunder ripping across the sky, not realizing that nuclear weapons were descending upon their fields. An emergency team scrambled to track the wreckage as flaming pieces of the B-52 rained down across farms, roads, and forests around the tiny town of Faro. In the hours immediately following the crash, Air Force recovery teams arrived under strict orders to secure the weapons at all costs, knowing that any mishandling or further damage could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. And as they approached the first bomb, still hanging from its deployed parachute in a tree, they discovered to their horror that 3 of its 4 safety devices had already been activated. Later analyses showed that if not for the single unarmed switch, one component that had miraculously remained in the safe position, the bomb would have completed its arming circuit and detonated. Meanwhile, the second bomb presented an even more complex challenge. Buried deep in the mud, its high explosive lens layers, used to compress the plutonium core during detonation, posed a danger of accidental triggering if disturbed. And worse, parts of its uranium secondary stage had scattered underground, some of which were never recovered. The Air Force eventually purchased the land to prevent anyone from digging too deeply and discovering fragments of the weapon's fissile material. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the Goldsboro disaster wasn't merely an accident. It was a symptom of a dangerous strategy that kept nuclear weapons in near constant motion over American soil, trusting fallible machines and human operators with apocalyptic power in the name of rapid readiness. Operation Chrome Dome, which kept armed bombers circling American cities 24/7, had already experienced several near disasters, but Goldsboro stood apart because, unlike other accidents, this one nearly detonated fully. Over the years, the U.S. government kept the details classified, maintaining that the bomb could not have exploded. But in 2013, a declassified memo from nuclear weapons engineer Parker F. Jones surfaced, bluntly stating, "One simple dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe." In the chaotic aftermath of the crash, local residents tried to make sense of the sudden military lockdown. Civilians finding parachutes tangled in trees, debris scattered across fields, and parts of the bomber embedded in the earth like meteorites, all while Air Force personnel quietly worked through the night to contain a disaster that could have rewritten American history. Though the public would not learn the full truth for decades, those involved in the response understood immediately that the nation had survived by pure chance. That on that night in 1961, in a freezing field outside the small town of Goldsboro, America came closer to nuking itself than it ever had before, or ever would again. In the days following the Goldsboro incident, as military teams combed through the wreckage of the B-52 and cataloged every fragment of the fallen hydrogen bombs, the scale of the near catastrophe began to reveal itself in chilling detail, prompting a classified investigation that shook even the most hardened nuclear weapons experts within the U.S. Air Force. And while the official public narrative spoke of a safe recovery effort and no danger to civilians, the internal reports painted a radically different picture, one in which the United States had come within seconds of detonating a multi-megaton thermonuclear device in its own backyard, a detonation that would have instantly transformed the rural landscape of North Carolina into a crater of radioactive glass, incinerating everything within miles and leaving the eastern seaboard crippled for generations. Investigators began by examining the first bomb, the one that descended gently under its parachute, as if performing a textbook nuclear strike, and what they found horrified them. The bomb had gone through nearly the entire arming sequence, following every step it was engineered to take during a wartime release, including powering up internal components, activating the high-voltage battery, and arming 3 of the 4 required safety mechanisms, all because the bomb, in its programming, believed it had been intentionally dropped over a Soviet target. And the only reason it did not complete the process was a single malfunctioning low-voltage switch, an electromechanical fail-safe that purely by chance had not toggled into the armed position as the bomb fell. The second bomb posed an even more complex challenge. Buried deep in the mud, its internal state could not be easily evaluated, but the immense force of impact raised fears that the high explosive lenses, precise chemical charges designed to compress the plutonium core, might have been damaged, creating the possibility of accidental detonation if handled incorrectly. And so technicians carefully excavated the site using small shovels, hand tools, and wooden planks to avoid vibration, often lying flat on their stomachs as they probed the soil, knowing that any mistake could cost dozens of lives. The deeper they dug, the more they realized how violently the bomb had slammed into the earth. Components were scattered across the pit. The uranium secondary stage had split apart, and large sections of the fusion core had vanished into the unstable soil, prompting the U.S. government to quietly purchase a large plot of land from the farmers who owned it, so that no one would ever dig too deeply and accidentally uncover radioactive remnants of the hydrogen bomb. Meanwhile, back in Washington, military leadership scrambled to contain the political and strategic fallout of the incident, particularly because tensions with the Soviet Union were extremely high at the time, and the United States was working hard to project an image of total nuclear competence and control. Allowing the world to learn that an American hydrogen bomb had nearly detonated on U.S. soil would have been a propaganda disaster, weakening international confidence and giving the USSR ammunition to portray the United States as reckless with the most destructive weapons ever created. As a result, the Pentagon swiftly classified nearly every detail of the accident, distributing only sanitized summaries to Congress and the press, claiming that multiple fail-safes had prevented any real danger, even though engineers on the ground knew this was patently false. One of those engineers, Parker F. Jones, a safety specialist at Sandia National Laboratories, later authored a detailed, brutally honest report titled Goldsboro Revisited, in which he analyzed the bomb's design and safety failures with clinical precision and concluded that the Mark 39 was flawed to a terrifying degree. His famous statement that one simple dynamo technology low-voltage switch had prevented a 4-megaton detonation would remain buried for more than 5 decades until the memo was declassified in 2013. But in 1961, Jones's evaluation triggered quiet panic within the U.S. nuclear weapons program, revealing that the Mark 39 was not an outlier, but rather one of many early Cold War bombs that lacked robust modern safety systems, and that the U.S. arsenal was filled with weapons far more likely to detonate accidentally than publicly acknowledged. The Air Force scrambled to reassure political leaders that nuclear weapons were safe, but internally, senior commanders demanded urgent redesigns, upgrades, and new protocols to prevent similar catastrophes. Their alarm was justified, because Goldsboro was not an isolated incident, but part of a troubling pattern. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United States had dozens of Broken Arrow events, accidents involving nuclear weapons, many of which were never publicly disclosed. What made Goldsboro unique was not that an accident had occurred, but how close the bomb had come to detonating. If the low-voltage switch had been in the armed position, which engineers later acknowledged happened unpredictably in some tests, the entire eastern United States might have been thrown into chaos. Nuclear blast modeling conducted decades later estimated that a 4-megaton detonation would have leveled everything within an 8-mile radius instantly, including the nearby town of Goldsboro and surrounding farms. Beyond that, thermal radiation would have caused third-degree burns up to 30 miles away, and radioactive fallout patterns suggest that winds at the time would have carried lethal contamination toward the cities of Raleigh, Norfolk, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and possibly New York, depending on atmospheric conditions. Millions could have been exposed to radiation, infrastructure across the eastern seaboard, could have collapsed, and the United States government would have faced the unimaginable scenario of responding to a nuclear disaster of its own making. But the consequences would not have stopped at U.S. borders. The Soviet Union would have observed a massive nuclear explosion on American soil using early warning satellites and radar systems, and might have misinterpreted it as a first strike gone wrong, or a test of a false flag operation, potentially triggering a retaliatory nuclear alert on the Soviet side, pushing the world closer to a war born entirely of misunderstanding. As investigators finished their on-site recovery work, removing bomb fragments, soil samples, and classified components, the U.S. government began constructing a long-term cover story, instructing spokesmen to insist the bombs had been recovered intact and fully safe, even though the first bomb had effectively armed itself during descent. Local residents, kept in the dark, were told that the incident posed no danger, even when radiation survey teams continued to visit farms for years afterward. And so, for decades, Goldsboro became a ghost memory, a Cold War secret buried under layers of redaction and denial, known only to the engineers, military officers, and intelligence analysts who understood how close the United States had come to its own annihilation. But the deeper significance of the Goldsboro incident wasn't simply the near detonation of a hydrogen bomb. It was what the event revealed about the fragility of Cold War nuclear safety systems, the fallibility of early weapons designs, and the horrifying reality that even superpowers operating at peak readiness could lose control of their own apocalyptic devices in an instant. It exposed the dangerous contradiction at the heart of nuclear deterrence, that in trying to prevent war through fear, the United States had created a system so vast and so complex that it risked triggering disaster through accident alone, and Goldsboro became a symbol, not publicly, but within the nuclear weapons community, of how close humanity was skating to the edge of extinction in the early Cold War. As investigators finalized their secret reports and technicians sealed away the last recovered components of the Mark 39 bombs, a more troubling truth began to emerge beneath the surface of the Goldsboro incident, one that revealed the deeper systemic flaws embedded within America's nuclear command structure, and showed how the accident was not a bizarre anomaly, but a predictable outcome of the Cold War's most dangerous policies. Policies that placed dozens of nuclear-armed bombers in the sky every single day, circling above American cities and coastlines with weapons capable of ending civilization. All because the United States feared that if those planes ever sat still, even for a moment, the Soviet Union might launch a first strike that would destroy them on the ground before they could take off. This concept, called airborne alert, became a cornerstone of Operation Chrome Dome, the massive Cold War initiative that kept bombers on constant flight paths 24/7, fully loaded with hydrogen bombs, ready to strike targets in the Soviet Union within minutes if the unthinkable happened. But as nuclear weapons engineers and strategic planners examined the implications of Goldsboro, they realized that Chrome Dome, intended to keep America safe, had instead transformed the country into a floating nuclear minefield. One gust of turbulence, one mechanical failure, one fatigued pilot, one malfunctioning switch away from accidental annihilation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, pressure mounted on American leadership to maintain an overwhelming nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union, and one of the ways they sought to achieve this was by ensuring that U.S. nuclear forces could never be fully destroyed in a surprise attack. The Air Force argued that the only way to guarantee retaliation was to keep armed bombers airborne around the clock, beyond the reach of Soviet missiles. So by the time Goldsboro occurred, Multiple Chrome Dome flights were in the air at any given time, each carrying up to 4 thermonuclear bombs, each of them far more powerful than the weapons used in World War II, and each pilot entrusted with the authority to begin the sequence of events that could reduce entire cities to ash. What few civilians understood was that Chrome Dome flights frequently suffered mechanical failures, hydraulic leaks, electrical anomalies, structural fatigue caused by long hours in the air, and engineers had warned privately that the B-52 Stratofortress, though massive and powerful, was never designed to carry such heavy loads indefinitely without resting on the ground. The Goldsboro bomber itself had flown for more than 8 hours before the fuel leak began. By that point, nearly 20,000 pounds of fuel had poured from its wing in a steady stream, weakening the aircraft's structural integrity and setting the stage for the catastrophic breakup. The tragedy was this: the accident would never have happened if Operation Chrome Dome had not existed. But Chrome Dome was born from fear. Fear of the Soviets launching a bolt-from-the-blue first strike. Fear that American nuclear weapons might be destroyed before they could be used. Fear that hesitation or slow response might result in national extinction. And so, thousands of airmen flew thousands of hours carrying bombs that, in some cases, had fewer safety features than the average modern toaster. Indeed, one of the most shocking revelations uncovered during the Goldsboro investigation was just how primitive early Cold War nuclear bomb safety mechanisms truly were. Contrary to public assurances, many weapons lacked modern strong link, weak link systems or coded barriers. Instead, their designs relied on mechanical switches, barometric triggers, and basic electrical circuits that could be activated accidentally if the weapon were jolted or released unexpectedly. The Mark 39 was one such bomb. Originally developed in the late 1950s, it had undergone incremental upgrades, but still relied on a fragile array of electromechanical switches to prevent detonation. In theory, the bomb required multiple conditions to be met before it could go off: separation from the aircraft, parachute deployment, barometric altitude sensing, nose impact, and electrical continuity. But in reality, the Goldsboro bomb had met nearly all those conditions by accident. A senior engineer later commented, "The bomb did what it was designed to do. The plane didn't." After Goldsboro, nuclear safety engineers pushed for urgent redesigns, but they ran headfirst into political resistance from military commanders who believed that adding too many safety devices might slow down activation during wartime or reduce the weapon's reliability in a real nuclear conflict. The uncomfortable truth was that, during much of the Cold War, nuclear weapons were intentionally built to be simple to arm and fast to deploy, even if that introduced enormous risks during accidents. And because Chrome Dome required that nuclear weapons remain in their most ready configuration during flight, much closer to armed than they would be on the ground, the risks multiplied. Goldsboro was only one of many near misses. In 1960, a bomber crashed in Indiana carrying nuclear weapons, and although nothing detonated, the incident raised alarm. In 1968, another B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland, scattering plutonium across the ice cap in an event so catastrophic that Denmark and the U.S. still dispute its long-term effects. In Spain in 1966, a mid-air collision over Palomares dropped 4 hydrogen bombs onto the village below, 2 of which ruptured and spread radioactive contamination. Chrome Dome was eventually terminated in 1968, following the Thule disaster, but by then, more than 700 nuclear weapons had been involved in accidents, crashes, fires, or emergency landings. And yet, the public was kept almost completely unaware of this reality. The U.S. government feared that admitting to systemic nuclear safety problems could damage public confidence, undermine deterrence, or fuel anti-nuclear activism that might pressure political leaders to cut back on America's nuclear arsenal. So incidents were buried, accidents were classified, and disasters were quietly swept aside. Only decades later, when the Cold War had ended and documents were gradually declassified, did the true extent of the danger become known. But the Goldsboro incident stood apart from all others because of the single switch revelation that one of the world's most powerful nuclear bombs had been a breath away from detonating, not because of enemy action, not because of sabotage, but because of ordinary hardware failure. Nuclear historian Eric Schlosser later summarized the event succinctly. "We almost nuked North Carolina by accident." The implications were staggering. If a bomb could nearly detonate from a simple mechanical failure, how many other weapons were vulnerable? How many other flights were one anomaly away from disaster? How many other parts of the United States might have been destroyed without a single Soviet missile ever being launched? These questions haunted the nuclear establishment for decades. Even today, nuclear safety experts use Goldsboro as a cautionary tale when discussing the dangers of early nuclear weapon designs and the near impossibility of maintaining perfect control over massive arsenals scattered across air bases, submarines, missile silos, and bomber fleets. Goldsboro demonstrated that nuclear deterrence was a game of probabilities, not certainties, that even the most disciplined military could not prevent every accident, and that as long as nuclear weapons existed, humanity would be living with an ever-present, if hidden, risk of apocalypse, born not only from deliberate war, but from tragic, unpredictable chance. In the years that followed the Goldsboro incident, the U.S. government moved rapidly to bury the story beneath layers of classification, internal secrecy, and misleading public statements that minimized the danger, creating an official narrative that insisted the bombs were never at risk of detonation, even though the engineers who examined the weapons knew that such claims were dangerously misleading. And as time went on, the Goldsboro near meltdown became one of the Cold War's most carefully guarded nuclear secrets, discussed only in closed-door meetings among military planners, safety specialists, and intelligence analysts who understood the frightening implications of how close the United States had come to annihilating itself through its own deterrent strategy. For decades, the public was told almost nothing. Local newspapers described a routine recovery. The Air Force issued statements saying that all safety devices had functioned perfectly, and the Pentagon declined to release any technical documentation, citing national security. While behind the scenes, senior officials debated how to rewrite safety protocols, redesign warheads, and prevent another near catastrophe without admitting publicly that such a disaster had nearly taken place. The secrecy stemmed not only from the desire to avoid public panic, but from political necessity. Any admission that a 4-megaton thermonuclear bomb had come within a single electrical trigger of exploding on American soil would have been a devastating blow to U.S. credibility in the Cold War, handing the Soviet Union a propaganda victory and fueling anti-nuclear sentiment at home that could have undermined America's entire strategic posture. And so, year after year, the Goldsboro incident faded from the public consciousness, remembered only by the farmers who saw the wreckage, the airmen who parachuted into the night, and a handful of engineers who had examined the bomb's remains and understood the magnitude of the disaster that had been narrowly avoided. But starting in the 1970s, a new force began to pry open the truth. Journalists, researchers, and nuclear historians who grew suspicious of the Air Force's vague explanations and began filing Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding access to the hidden technical reports. Among them was a reporter named Joel Dobson, whose years of persistence revealed inconsistencies in the official story. Another was a congressman named David Price, who became convinced that the public had the right to know the truth about nuclear safety. But perhaps the most important figure in uncovering the Goldsboro truth was Parker F. Jones, the Sandia National Laboratory's safety engineer who had authored the landmark internal memo titled Goldsboro Revisited. Jones had spent years studying the bomb's arming system, and unlike the Air Force's public statements, he wrote bluntly that the Mark 39 Mod 2 bomb did not possess adequate safety devices to prevent accidental detonation. His memo explained that out of the weapon's 4 safety mechanisms, 3 had failed during the fall, some automatically triggered by the parachute deployment, and that only the final low-voltage arm safe switch, which had not flipped to armed, prevented a hydrogen bomb from turning part of North Carolina into a radioactive crater. It is a near miracle that the bomb did not detonate, Jones wrote in one section, adding, "One simple dynamo technology switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe." His memo remained classified for decades, sealed away in government archives, but it eventually became the smoking gun that proved the Air Force's reassurances were false. When nuclear historian Eric Schlosser began researching the American nuclear arsenal for his book Command and Control, he stumbled across hints of Goldsboro in scattered declassified fragments and decided to investigate, filing FOIA requests that triggered a slow but steady trickle of newly released documents. Many requests were denied. Others came back heavily redacted, the technical diagrams obscured with black ink, the descriptions of arming sequences removed, the safety evaluation pages missing entirely. But in 2013, after years of pressure, the National Security Archive finally released Parker F. Jones's memo in full, and the truth became undeniable. The bomb had not been fully safe. It had not been well protected. It had nearly detonated. The revelation sparked instant headlines around the world. U.S. nearly nuked itself. Hydrogen bomb a switch away from blowing up North Carolina. Cold War nuclear safety exposed as myth. Suddenly, what had once been a forgotten footnote in military history became a case study in the dangers of nuclear deterrence, cited in academic papers, congressional hearings, and strategic policy debates as proof that even the most advanced nations cannot maintain complete control over their nuclear arsenals. Meanwhile, in Goldsboro, residents reacted with shock and anger, many learning for the first time that their town had been one decision, one mechanical moment, one electrical millisecond away from destruction. Some farmers who had allowed investigators onto their land realized that the fallout would have killed not only them, but their children and grandchildren. Others discovered that parts of the second bomb were still buried under their fields, fenced off by the government for environmental safety, though in reality the land had been purchased to prevent anyone from digging into radioactive components that had never been recovered. The Air Force attempted to downplay the revelations, releasing new statements suggesting that the bomb had additional safety features not mentioned in Jones's memo. But these claims were vague, unsupported, and contradicted by engineering diagrams in the declassified materials. By now, public trust had eroded, and nuclear experts sided overwhelmingly with Jones. But the Goldsboro cover-up went deeper than simply hiding the technical details. It reflected a broader Cold War mindset in which both superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, believed that admitting to nuclear vulnerabilities would be tantamount to inviting attack. As a result, the United States suppressed not only Goldsboro, but dozens of other nuclear accidents, while the Soviet Union hid its own disasters, including missile explosions, warhead fires, and accidental detonations of conventional explosives inside nuclear devices. In this sense, Goldsboro was not just a U.S. failure, it was part of a global pattern of nuclear secrecy that defined the Cold War, a world in which governments routinely lied to their citizens to maintain the illusion of perfect control. As congressional inquiries in the early 2000s revealed more details about Cold War nuclear operations, Goldsboro became a centerpiece of criticism, fueling arguments for modernizing America's nuclear arsenal, strengthening safety protocols, and improving command and control systems. Experts pointed out that many of the weapons still deployed around the world, on submarines, bombers, and intercontinental missiles, were descendants of early designs that lacked the redundant safety systems considered necessary today. Some analysts warned that Goldsboro could happen again, not necessarily in the United States, but anywhere nuclear powers maintain aging arsenals. Others argued that the world had simply been lucky for over half a century, that Goldsboro was not a freak accident, but rather the most dramatic example of a long chain of near misses, any one of which could have triggered a catastrophe far worse than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Yet despite all the revelations, debates, and historical analyses, one fact remained clear. The world had never fully reckoned with the truth of Goldsboro, and the incident remained both a symbol of Cold War danger and a reminder of the razor-thin line between safety and annihilation, a line that even the most powerful nation on Earth once crossed without even realizing how close it had come to ending life as we know it. In the decades after the Goldsboro Broken Arrow, as the Cold War transformed from a hair-trigger nuclear standoff into a more complex geopolitical rivalry, and eventually into a long, uneasy peace, the meaning of the Goldsboro incident evolved from a classified embarrassment into a profoundly important lesson about the fragility of nuclear safety, the danger of complacency, and the terrifying reality that humanity's survival during the Cold War depended not on flawless technology or perfect planning, but on luck, pure, blind, uncontrollable luck. And when historians, policymakers, and nuclear scientists revisited Goldsboro long after its details were unsealed, they found themselves confronted with a disturbing truth: that the greatest nuclear near miss in American history had not been prevented by brilliant engineering or superior command, but by a single electrical switch that happened not to flip in the chaos of a mid-air disintegration. That thin margin, one switch, one moment, one improbable stroke of chance, became the central symbol of Goldsboro's legacy, a reminder that the Cold War had been a period in which humanity lived constantly on the edge of annihilation, protected not by invincible systems, but by a precarious mixture of human judgment, mechanical failure, and sheer coincidence. In the years following the incident, nuclear weapons engineers across the United States began pushing urgently for a redesign of America's stockpile, arguing that the Mark 39's near detonation revealed structural flaws in early Cold War warheads. And although military commanders initially resisted, fearing that increasing safety features might slow wartime activation, the evidence was overwhelming. The nation could no longer rely on crude electromechanical switches and jerry-rigged safety circuits to guard against accidental explosions. Gradually, through the 1970s and 1980s, nuclear safety systems became more sophisticated. Environmental sensing devices were strengthened, Strong link, weak link architectures were introduced, and permissive action links, electronic locks requiring coded authorization to arm a warhead, were integrated into newer weapons. But Goldsboro also revealed something deeper and more troubling. Nuclear safety wasn't only about the devices themselves, it was about the systems surrounding them. Operation Chrome Dome, which had placed armed bomber fleets in the sky around the clock, was eventually canceled, not because of international diplomacy, but because of mounting internal fear that accidents like Goldsboro, Palomares, and Thule made the airborne alert posture too dangerous to sustain. But even though Chrome Dome ended, the underlying strategy never disappeared. Nuclear weapons continued to be deployed on submarines, in missile silos, on mobile launchers, and in vaults beneath air bases across the world. And each new generation of nuclear hardware brought with it new risks, new failure modes, and new possibilities for catastrophe. And as nuclear arsenals spread beyond the United States and the Soviet Union to France, Britain, China, India, Pakistan, and potentially even rogue states, the world inherited a new era of danger in which nations with far fewer safety resources, far less oversight, and far more political volatility possessed weapons capable of erasing entire regions. In this global context, Goldsboro became more than just an American cautionary tale. It became a universal message about the uncontrollable nature of nuclear technology. When experts at the International Atomic Energy Agency and various nuclear watchdog groups began compiling lists of global nuclear accidents, Goldsboro was placed among the most severe, alongside the Petrov incident, the 1979 NORAD false alarm, the 1980 Damascus Titan II explosion, and the 1983 Soviet early warning false launch alert. These incidents, scattered across continents and decades, formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Nuclear weapons were not stable, predictable, or perfectly controlled. They were objects of immense destructive power embedded within human institutions that were themselves fragile, bureaucratic, and prone to error. In this sense, Goldsboro exposed a deeper flaw in the logic of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence assumes that nations act rationally, that systems function correctly, and that leaders make calculated decisions. But Goldsboro showed that nuclear war might begin not through geopolitical miscalculation or intentional aggression, but through accident, through a loose screw, a fatigued pilot, a mechanical failure, or a single electrical switch that just happens to be in the wrong position at the wrong moment. As nuclear theorist Scott Sagan famously argued, things that have never happened before happen all the time, and Goldsboro was proof of that principle. When the bomb squad recovered the first Mark 39 from the tree and saw that 3 of its 4 safety devices had already armed themselves automatically, they realized that the distance between safety and global catastrophe was far smaller than they had previously believed. In later interviews, men who had helped secure the site admitted openly that they had been terrified, not only of the bomb detonating, but of the realization that nuclear weapons might not be as safe as they had been taught. One recovery technician, speaking decades later, said, "That night changed the way I thought about my country, my job, and the world. I realized we weren't in control. We were just lucky." That sentiment echoed across the nuclear establishment as more details emerged. In the 1990s and early 2000s, when congressional investigators finally reviewed declassified missile accident reports and nuclear incident logs, they found dozens of cases where human error, mechanical malfunction, or miscommunication could have resulted in accidental nuclear detonations. The Goldsboro incident became a case study in military academies, lectures, and classified strategy seminars as an example of how technological complexity can create risks that no doctrine, no command structure, and no political system can fully eliminate. But beyond the policy debates, Goldsboro had a personal legacy too, a legacy felt by the crew members who survived the crash, the families whose farms were torn apart by wreckage, and the people of North Carolina who would later learn how narrowly their state had escaped destruction. Major Walter Tulloch, the B-52's pilot, carried the memory of that night for the rest of his life, knowing that his desperate fight to save a failing aircraft had unknowingly carried the potential to unleash unimaginable devastation. The families who owned the land where the second bomb buried itself grew, used to seeing Air Force personnel arrive periodically to test the soil for radiation, and many were never told exactly what had happened under their feet. Meanwhile, the fragments of the second bomb remain buried even today, encased beneath a permanent easement purchased by the government, a silent reminder that the Cold War left physical scars on the American landscape, just as surely as it left psychological ones on the men and women who lived through it. In the decades since the incident, the Goldsboro site has become a kind of ghost monument, a place where people visit knowing that history almost took a radically different path, a path in which one of the largest nuclear explosions in history would have occurred not in wartime but by accident, not in an enemy nation but on U.S. soil. Today, the Goldsboro Broken Arrow serves as one of the strongest arguments for nuclear safety reform and global disarmament efforts, a case cited by former Defense Secretary William Perry, nuclear scientist Theodore Postel, and countless others who warn that the world remains at risk not only from intentional nuclear conflict, but from accident, ignorance, and the inherent unpredictability of complex weapon systems. And as newer technologies, AI-driven warning systems, hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare tools, begin to reshape the nature of nuclear command and control, experts fear that the world may enter a new era of Goldsboro-like risks, in which small glitches amplify into global crises before human operators have time to react. In this sense, the true legacy of Goldsboro is not only the disaster that didn't happen, it is the warning it continues to send, a warning carved into the muddy fields of North Carolina and echoed through every nuclear command center on the planet. That as long as nuclear weapons exist, so does the possibility of catastrophe, and no nation, no matter how powerful, careful, or technologically advanced, is immune from the dangers of its own creations. And so, the story of Goldsboro endures, not as a relic of Cold War paranoia, but as a reminder that humanity's survival has always depended on more than strength, strategy, or deterrence. It has depended on humility, awareness, and the recognition that even the most advanced weapon systems rest on a foundation far more fragile than anyone would like to admit. Goldsboro was a near miss, but its message is a direct hit, a stark, unforgettable testament to how close we came to disaster and how easily it could happen again.